We live in a world. This is such an obvious and accepted idea that overtly saying it like that comes off somewhat comical. However, the question of what this world is and where its edge is drawn has beguiled humanity since as far back as we can remember. To the modern mind, raised in its drunken state of materialism, this question seems easy to answer. The world is the stuff we see, touch, smell, taste, and feel. It is whatever the phenomena we experience is made of. In the simplicity of this answer rests the deception of its axioms. Namely, what does it mean to see something? What is a thing? We take the material for granted in our daily lives, but upon close inspection, our definitions break down when describing things materially. While it is true on the one hand, our quote-unquote world is simply the geography we exist in physically, the classical three dimensions, we also know on a level so fundamentally deep within us so as to remain unconsciously adhered to, that it is the landscape of meaning. We are not simply in some objective material realm, though that is also true. We exist in the teleological realm of our narratives. We see the objective world through the lens of our mind's internal stories. We do not analyze things in the material world simply according to their matter, and even if this were possible, the categories that we would use to differentiate one thing from another would all require some relative reason for doing so. Why is it when we see a landscape, we separate trees from grass, from sky, from ground, from people, etc.? Aren't all of these things linked together by simple fact of existing spatially? What is it that divides and measures the totality of the landscape into pieces? I believe the sword by which we cut reality into pieces is narrative. And narrative is also how we assemble a coherent, comprehensible picture of that reality. For example, we do not refer to a chair as its constituent parts, the 3 pounds of wood, 2 ounces of metal, a few ounces of paint, etc., because we know what a chair is, and we have the narrative that this object is used for, sitting. A chair is the name we give to the unity of these parts, their purpose. The chair, as with the stop sign example I gave in the introduction, exists as a teleological object because of the shared purpose its parts have within the narrative of our lives. We often also evaluate distances this way. We are not simply in a spatial realm when we are on vacation. We are far away from home. There are many examples of this, but suffice it to say, we do not simply see some objective world objectively. We see our subjective stories, and it is through these stories that we perceive the objective world. If my assumption is correct about stories and myths being humanity's way of connecting each of our individual processors or brains with others to create a larger entity called a culture, and then that culture stores up its data for later use by later cultures, then I think an issue plaguing the unpacking of these files is often due to the translational errors found in shifts in cultural paradigms. We have both a bandwidth problem and a problem of memory. Words change, subtleties are lost, and we become isolated on the island of our own culture, unable to translate the valuable data found in others. This is akin to a literalist not being able to find the core truth of a metaphoric aphorism, say, quote-unquote, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. They miss the point because they cannot or will not interact with the abstract layer underneath their own language, perhaps ignorant by their own prideful assumption that their culture, language, etc. are the defaults, and thus cannot translate a thing they do not understand into something they can. I've jokingly referred to this phenomena as the left brainification of modern culture, and I plan on talking about that in full in a later video. But suffice it to say that in order to translate between 2 languages, core abstractions like nouns, verbs, etc. must be distilled, so both parties can notice their presence within their idiosyncratic manifestations. Think of these abstractions like building blocks that can be of any color, but are used the same regardless of their veneer. I say all of this to get to this point. As I said in the preface, there is a split in the modern world between the quote-unquote physical sciences and the quote-unquote meta, meaning beyond, physics. The goal of the materialist scientist is to find out at its core what the nature of reality is built of. To a materialist, a quote-unquote thing is what it quote-unquote is. To the materialist, the core of reality is a material substance. This is in contrast to the teleological view, in which the core nature of reality is a why, not a what. In the teleological worldview, it is not some quark or string that is the base material that all things are built of, but a telos or a purpose, and it is this telos that acts as the core building block of the material universe. So materialism says it's a what, and teleology says it's a why. But why does the materialist scientist search for the fundamental what that the material world is made of? Why is this even a curiosity? If it is simply an is, does it not suffice to say it is? Why does what it is matter so much? It seems to me the materialist is in pursuit of this base matter because there is some value in understanding it. Perhaps it might give us clues for how to navigate reality, what we should do with our time, where we are going and how we got here, etc. In other words, why? These two schools are in pursuit of the same thing, the bedrock of reality from which to measure all according to. Yet they swear up and down that they are fundamentally opposed. Are they in truth only opposed in their phraseology and the complications arising from the implications of their idiosyncratic phraseology? They use different words to describe the same phenomena, and thus they are convinced they are in search of and describing different things. Put another way, the religious is attempting to give a quote-unquote what to their why through ritual, theology, personal growth, etc., while the materialist has a quote-unquote why at their core, driving the pursuit of their quote-unquote what. While I believe the materialist language and worldview is ultimately dangerous at worst, and impotent at providing a coherent explanation of reality at best, it is one of my goals to at least bridge the language between what could be called the secular and religious, so we can figure out where the real disagreements lay, beyond the semantic. The materialist framing of our modern culture hamstrings our ability to interact with our past. Like a new operating system that can't unpack the zip files left to us by our ancestors. It is also hamstringing our ability to make a map we can share in our present to better plot a course to our survival. Our modern materialist culture could be thought of as a person who will not journal or go to therapy about some past trauma, so they live in a moment-to-moment state of ignorance, unable to fix their unhealthy patterns or mental problems because they have no understanding to the underlying causes. They don't know how they got where they are because they will not communicate with their past. And thus, wherever they are is simply that, where they are. It's like the cultural version of someone losing their memory every morning. We have little idea how we got here, save the immediate clues we see around us, and have no real way to know where we came from and which way we should go. Thus, we are reduced to immediate needs and impulses. Materialist culture is adrift in a sea of impulsive hedonism because its language and paradigm keeps it from being able to communicate with its past in a clear way. We have no story to trust other than, quote-unquote, pursue your liberty and happiness. And to boot, this worldview is so foundational to how we see the world that trying to point it out in many people is as difficult as getting them to see their own eye color without a mirror. You'd say, "You have green eyes," and they'd say, "I don't see green anywhere except the grass." This phenomena is especially frustrating in the religiously inclined within the West, but more on that later. I get it though, it's hard to see outside of your worldview. How can you see what's beyond your horizon? How can you know what you don't know? To know what you don't know, you need to explore. But to explore, there needs to be a spot left open in your worldview for mystery or the unknown. The issue with modern materialism and postmodernism is the utter blind faith by which its adherents accept its precepts. It's like people thinking they don't have an accent, but everyone else does. They lack the self-awareness to see that they have an accent too. Their starting position is not the starting position. Their accent isn't the quote-unquote normal one. It's one of many. They lack the ability to see their own worldview from an objective vantage because they're under the delusion that their worldview is the objective vantage. The myth of what I suppose could be called modern secularism or popular culture is that it is the baseline, and its role as standard is simply taken for granted by the everyday individual. The secular individual does not think of themselves as adhering to a religion, a cult, a worldview, etc. They simply think their life and beliefs are the baseline standard of reality. To them, to be quote-unquote secular is to somehow be partaking in the objective reality of the world. This delusion utterly hamstrings their ability to analyze their own beliefs, because to them, they simply don't have beliefs. They're secular. They cannot explain to you how the secular world arrives at moral truths like murder being wrong or inclusion being right, etc., because in the myth of secularism, these truths are somehow self-evident, regardless of their effervescent and malleable nature over time. Somehow slavery at one point in the secular world was acceptable, yet now it is not. Where did this updated patch of morality come from? The false confidence the postmodern mind has in its understanding of the universe is the confidence of a blind man running along a cliff's edge. Or like someone watching Monty Python and the Holy Grail thinking it's historic, and then believing our ancestors were simply ignorant, stupid, or unenlightened. To belabor the point, we're the one at the party who proudly proclaims, "Well, actually, that's not true," in great self-satisfaction, in response to the self-aware sarcastic statement made by someone else in the group. We think we're the one critiquing, but to everyone else we've made ourselves the butt of the joke. Our literalism, as a result of what Nietzsche called killing God, has made us the awkward left brain of history that, like the person at the party who misinterpreted the joke, is utterly confident that it knows everything because it can't know what it doesn't already know. We think we're deconstructing our forefathers, but we are the one at the party that everyone's laughing at. We're the emperor with no clothes who doesn't know he's naked because everyone for the moment is playing along. Because you cannot derive an ought from an is, materialism leaves the only interpretive lens to be subjective experience and power. With no spirit, there is no way to ever fully understand someone's texts, as understanding in the materialist and eventually postmodern paradigm is ironically akin to empirical knowledge. And since objective knowledge is impossible for a subjective being, the whole of the world is rendered incomprehensible. There is no way for two subjective perspectives to be reconciled within a materialist or postmodern paradigm. This framing is immediately recognized as the postmodernist critical theory and deconstruction of the past. And it seems to me that postmodern critical theory has the awareness level of Dwight from The Office, who is confident in his critical analysis of which bear is best. I want to argue that it is somewhat logically coherent, though perversely so, that if you start with an is, your why as a narrative, being contingent upon an is, will inevitably become the self. And as we know, one's self being the center of interpretation is what psychologists often call narcissism. The self becomes the why, because in a materialist or relativist paradigm, what's pleasurable is determined by the individual, and what's morally right is what pragmatically works. But who decides what is working? If there is only the subjective, then reality is simply a battleground of wills in which the mightiest decides what is true. One might say, well, can't every individual simply do what they want? What's wrong with that? But what if their wants impede or harm another individual? How do you settle disputes between two individuals, quote-unquote, following their bliss, when each of their blisses put them at odds? My point is this: the materialist and eventually postmodern paradigms are incoherent to such a degree that when taken to their logical conclusions, there is nothing within their paradigms that helps or allows for separate individuals to live, work together, or reconcile, and that the ultimate end of taking these worldviews serious is existentially detrimental to every level of human interaction. If every cell in a living organism were to have an idiosyncratic worldview or direction, the body itself is in a state of what we call decay. Without a unifying direction or DNA that each cell can follow, we can't even call it a body, for a body by definition is a unity of parts. It is for this reason I want to take part in bridging the gap between the ancient and modern mind. To do so I must translate, and to translate I must distill some things down to their abstractions, and show that this line we draw between the material and the spiritual, or the secular and the sacred, might in fact not exist, or at least is far blurrier than we currently believe. I grew up in a religious context, and as such, you can imagine I heard terms like spirit quite often. But I was never satisfied with the explanation of what these spirits were, where they were, and what made them and their world different from me and the one I live in. Later in life, I grew frustrated with the descriptions of spiritual matters I'd hear from believers both inside and outside the church. Stories of seeing ghosts, demons, hearing voices, experiencing physical contact, etc., etc. Did no one see? If you can see it, hear it, feel it, etc., how is it not simply physical? And yet these stories always included elements of the quote-unquote paranormal, or high strangeness as Forteans would dub it. You can see the ghost, but your hand would only touch the wall behind you should you reach out and grasp its empirical frame. Similarly, descriptions of heaven or hell always felt incoherent or silly. The way everyone was describing the spirit world felt sort of like a different physical dimension, one that had its own gravity, light, height, width, etc. Only when you're there, you're more like Obi-Wan's Force Ghost, which is at one hand entirely physical as it glows the color blue and is observable by the human eye, but physical in a silly, ephemeral way. If we can see the ghost with our eyes, it means they must be material in at least some sense, and yet this contradicts the entire physical-metaphysical dichotomy. If we have bodies in the afterlife, how is the spiritual realm any different than the physical? It made no sense to me. Yet this way of conceptualizing the spirit can make total sense if it's not framed in the materialist paradigm. As how do you conceive of a thing totally out of your experience? You have to use metaphor and analogy to even glimpse it. Even materialist scientists and physicists engage in this act of parabolic representation of concepts too alien for the human mind to grasp. Stories like Flatland, for example, help us grasp higher dimensional vantage points by symbolically discussing it through our three-dimensional view on the two dimensions. You obviously can't take this literally, because there's no way a two-dimensional digestive tract, for example, could exist, as it would cut a two-dimensional being in half. But that's the point. It's a story. It's a metaphor. We need these metaphors to help us see beyond what we currently can. And yet these stories that help us grasp this world beyond our sight can also blind us from it if they transgress from analogy and balloon out into implications never intended by the original parable. It's been my experience that the modern religious mind partakes in its religiousness through its axiomatic lens of materialism. This explains the predilection to theists attempting to scientifically prove the existence of God utilizing materialist means, or the obsession with cryptid or ghost hunters attempting to capture some picture or clump of hair to prove the existence of the supernatural. If materialism can prove God, spirit, ghosts, etc., then at core, material is the fundamental truth. Put another way, if the means by which one proves God is through empiricism, then it is the empirical method that is the foundational layer on which a thing like God is being judged. If the spirit world is proven through the material, then the spirit is nothing more than, pardon the pun, a ghost of the material world. If we try to explain the spiritual through materialist means, the absurd premise of materialism renders the spiritual absurd as well. Trying to understand the spiritual through materialism is like trying to understand a metaphor through its literal interpretation. No, there are not actually two birds in the bush, nor is there one in your hand. The person saying this is not insane. You're just not getting their point. If in the Western world we accept materialism on an unconscious axiomatic layer, it makes sense to me that the descriptions of the spirit world are never simply metaphoric or attempts to explain something outside of our experience using things we find in our world as symbols. Materialism is our accepted truth, and we fashionably layer a sort of flavor text of belief on top of it. Because materialism is our truth, we attempt to explain the spiritual through the materialist paradigm, i.e., I see ghosts with my physical eye, which means they must in some way have physical form, but are just kind of wacky with the opacity turned down. Or we will go to heaven, and if we are going to it, it must be a place that has height, width, depth, etc. And all of these are not just metaphors or symbols to explain things outside of our grasp, but scientific descriptions of material realities. This is absurd. Thinking this way makes the spiritual simply another physical realm that is just more translucent than our current one, and maybe there you can fly or something. As I said in the preface, this renders all quote-unquote beliefs the materialists engage in nothing more than a LARP. The cosplaying Jedi who gets pulled over for speeding when driving home from Comic-Con does not try the Jedi mind trick on the officer. He has an axiomatic ground layer, and his narratives of spirits, gods, etc. are simply role-playing games that collapse the moment he's confronted with the real world. To summarize, the materialistic conceptualizations of spirit and the spirit world I grew up around, both from the church and pop culture, etc., are absurd and self-refuting. Trying to prove God materially only exposes the material as your God, for the thing that gives proof to the other is the judge. In my context within the Christian church, it also felt strange to me that the Creator would make a physical world that he declared good, and then decide the ultimate trajectory for the beings he inhabited this physical world with, humans, was to leave it and go to heaven. Why not just start with heaven? This paradigm also veers far too close to Gnosticism, which believes the physical world to be bad by nature and the spirit to be good. I'm going to do a deep dive into that in another video, but needless to say, this paradigm makes no sense to me. What does is the idea that bodies are just that, bodies, and what they embody is spirit. The biblical creation of paradise was where heaven and earth met, meaning the ideal and the instantiation were in unity. Without the body, where would these ideals be? At least in the Christian tradition, the very act of creating a physical world implies its value as a tool for embodying something. So then, to skip a few steps, if in this paradigm our physical bodies are the bodies for our souls, spirits, etc., where do those spirits go when the body is destroyed? Where were they before the body was made? If they were or will be simply in some other form of body akin to Obi-Wan's Force Ghost, what is the purpose for the physical body? I realize I'm getting ahead of myself here, but the point I'm trying to make is that our conceptions of the spiritual in modern times are innately materialistic. We think of heaven as having height, width, depth, etc. You can see with eyes, hear with ears, etc. While these narratives to describe the spirit world may have started by using the material world as an example, the example has become fact in the modern religious and secular mind, and when stretched to such ridiculous degree, they become incoherent. The characters in a book do not live in the literal paper and ink of a book, and yet without the book the characters would not have form. When a child asks where his favorite storybook characters are, and the parents say, "in the book," we know it to be folly for the child to tear apart the pages looking for them. They do exist in the book, but in a more subtle way. Their patterns manifest in the reading of the book, and yet, they also exist independently from each person's specific reading. So where are they? We can argue that ideas and physical laws are only present in their incarnations, and I think one would rightly do so. But the issue here is this. These laws manifest consistently across many idiosyncratic manifestations, meaning there is some hierarchical order the instantiations follow that makes them consistent. Take the letters of these sentences, for example. The letters themselves as abstractions don't exist until they do. However, the concept of the letter T, for example, exists seemingly independent from every idiosyncratic use of it, hence your ability to recognize it as the letter T. One can easily argue in the case of language that these abstractions simply exist in the collective minds of the humans that know the language, but this explanation fails to explain in whose mind are the laws of physics. Where were the laws of fluidity when there were no waves to incarnate them? Where exactly are these laws written, and who or what is it that governs them? Am I not simply talking about patterns? Of course. Yet what exactly are patterns? An example I've often used to illustrate my assumption on how to conceive of what antiquity called spirit and what we might call patterns is a question I've asked my friends when talking about this topic. Where does a video game go when you turn it off? Now, I understand the question is a bit inadequate because of course the game doesn't go anywhere. The game is a pattern that the hardware runs whenever the power is turned on. The characters in the game do not go to sleep when you turn the power off, nor do they continue their journey. They are nowhere. For all intents and purposes, nothing within the world of the game exists when the game is off. That said, we all feel on some level this is not entirely true. When you turn your copy of a game off, the game does not cease to exist at large. The characters appear in other places independently from the game, say artwork tie-ins, stories, etc. These characters also exist within the minds of all who played the game. Thus, the world of the game is not limited to the incarnation of its pattern when your personal copy is powered on, and one could argue the game exists within the vast network of these manifestations. If the game still exists when the power for your personal copy is turned off, where is it? You might say, well, it's everywhere else the game is still on, etc. But what if they're all turned off? The data for the game is stored in some sort of hardware, but the experience of the game is not. The game, like a story, is a phenomena that happens over time, meaning it exists when it's happening, and it doesn't exist when it's not. And yet that explanation seems inadequate, because we know with something like books or games, etc., that the data for the pattern is stored in some sort of hardware. It all kind of seems paradoxical. Regardless, the point of this question is to illustrate that the pattern of the game exists both solely in the mind, and yet impossibly independent from it. It is both something that only exists when it manifests, and yet exists independently in some way from its manifestations. One could rightly argue that this existence is completely contingent upon the human mind, and that the game would truly cease to exist if all human consciousnesses did. And while in this example I think this argument has credit, it loses its potency with my next example. Mathematical constants are just that, constant, and thus consistent across all places we see them manifest. Pi, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, is the same across all circles of any size. And this would assumably be the same case across every world in the universe. While the language used to describe these phenomena is ours, the phenomena themselves are not. They are expressed by humans, but are in no way anthropocentric, meaning they are not some projection of the human mind trying to make sense of a random world, but are a window into the structure of what could rightly be called eternal. These ratios exist independently from humanity. They are at work in how plants grow, how life evolves, how celestial objects form, how galaxies move, etc. The laws of physics that are used to govern the universe exist independent from our languages used to describe them. while they only seem to exist when they are manifested, i.e., the way a star forms or why planets are mostly spherical, they exist independent from any star or planet because every planet and star form in like manner. When our own star ends, the physics that governed that star's birth and death will not. And while the shape of the numbers used to describe these laws are of our design, the quantities and phenomena they explain are not. Even if the universe is to end, and with it all scientific and mathematical laws, there would still presumably need to be some law or set of laws that would govern this ending. So then where are these laws? When our quote-unquote game is turned off, when the universe ends, where do the letters of the cosmic story go? Where were they before the story started? Were there laws before the universe came into existence? By what laws did it even come into existence? If there's no matter in the universe, would there still be laws of physics? I believe if matter acts according to laws that are consistent across all of matter, it is safe to presume those laws existed prior to matter. If matter is subordinate to these laws, which is what we observe, then this must be the case. Let me put it this way. Say we have a bouncy ball, and we'll think of this bouncy ball as the matter in the universe. We'll put a sensor inside this ball so we can track and record its movement. Then say we toss this ball into a room that is too dark for us to see the size and shape of with our eyes. As the ball bounces, it will bounce according to the walls within the shape of that room. Over time, we could analyze via the sensor the consistent patterns we see the ball taking, and through this consistency, create a sort of negative image of the room. This room is like the laws of physics. We can only observe these laws by the effects they have on matter, like the ball bouncing in the room. Like using echolocation, we cannot directly see the laws of physics, the room in this example, but by observing the patterns in how things bounce, we can get a sense to the layout of the room. If this is the case, then it must stand that the laws of physics, while manifested in the matter we observe, must in some sense exist independently. The laws that governed the birth of our universe, and will govern its demise, must exist independently from the physical matter of the universe, if the physical matter of the universe acts in subordination to them. If this is in fact the case, where are they? Where did the patterns dwell before the material world was material? This phenomena is not limited to ethereal mathematical concepts, but is also observable in geometric shapes. For example, a triangle is a shape that exists both physically and transcendentally. What I mean is, triangularity exists as a concept before we draw the shape. However, it does not, for all intents and purposes, exist to us until we manifest it. This must be the case because across all manifestations of triangularity, there is some standard we use as a sifter to judge what is a triangle from a square, circle, etc. This standard is a set of criteria a shape must possess to be called a triangle, i.e. 3 lines, 3 points, etc. Shapes gain status as such when a specific, for lack of a better term, resonance is reached. Think of this like how notes on a musical scale work. While there are infinite gradations of pitch between every note, the specific resonant difference between intervals, which in the Western canon is 1.05946, is the shape, quote-unquote, necessary for the next note to manifest. This difference is teleologically bracketed and given a name, the note. This is not completely arbitrary, as I can hear you materialists argue. These differences are like mathematical constants. While the specifics can change, the ratios cannot. And while I understand there are multiple traditions of music that have intervals between this, like microtonality in many musical traditions, these notes themselves have specific geometric organizations as well, and only make major, minor, etc. chords with one another when the specific mathematical orientations harmonize. Meaning you cannot produce the ratio we call a major chord using microtonality unless the notes that are between the Western canon of notes themselves are harmonically organized with other notes according to the ratios that comprise a major chord. This is similar to how geometric shapes work. While the listed criteria of a triangle contains 3 lines, these lines must be organized in a specific way to achieve status as a triangle. While there are many potential organizations of 3 lines, these potentials collapse when a triangle manifests. This, like musical notes, can be noted as not simply some anthropomorphic phenomena, because in a true physical sense, the shape scales consistently, as the musical notes do when you play any octave of them across a piano. It's as if in the realm of potentiality, there are nodes where infinite potential collapses into consistent shapes. But where are these nodes when the notes aren't being played? Where is the triangle shape stored before we draw it? It must necessarily predate the triangle we sketch because we use it as a rubric while sketching to assess our drawing. We hold up our idiosyncratic triangle to this ephemeral ideal one, and then use its shape to guide our pen and our eraser when we do not rightly meet its mark. It's like some form we're tracing with our pen, and yet where does this form exist? From our mind? But our mind condensed this shape from a pre-existing network or hierarchy of shapeness. Our mind cannot think of shapes that do not in some way exist. Thus, the idea's existence predates the idiosyncratic triangle in our mind. How else do we know if we've accurately sketched it? Now, at this point, one might rightly conclude that I'm touching on Aristotelian teleology, as well as maybe Platonism. While in many ways this is the case, as I said in the introduction of this chapter, as well as the preface of this series, that it is not my intention to reinvent the wheel, but rather to act as a translator between the ancient and modern mind, to explain it in such a way that the modern mind may comprehend. Or put another way, to give this quote-unquote wine an updated wineskin. To that end, I'll interchangeably use terms like potentiality with realm of the archetypes, ocean of chaos, or spirit world, etc., because it is my intention to show the connective mythological sinew between the seemingly separate paradigms that utilize these terms. For now, I'll focus on potentiality, which should not act as a stumbling block to the materialist who, I presume, will accept schools of thought like physics or quantum mechanics. The quote-unquote realm of potentiality could be perceived on a hierarchy with what is impossible at the top, and then a ladder of gradations down to what is at the bottom. To illustrate crudely, a triangle at the bottom can exist at the first strata of potential above it as any size, with any color on the level above that, and the angled distribution above that. However, a triangle can never have 4 sides. This means the quote-unquote potential of a triangle with 4 sides is in the quote-unquote impossible at the top of this potentiality hierarchy. Another example closer to home might be, you could learn guitar in the future, but the odds of you learning how to fly of your own power at any point is far less likely. Learning guitar is lower on the hierarchy of potentials, closer to the rungs that we call our current reality, while your flight is closer to impossible. You can circumnavigate the globe, but you cannot do it in 30 minutes. There is, however, a potential future in which we discover a way to travel fast enough for you to do this, but this potential is not currently possible. Thus, on the hierarchy of potentials, it is higher up toward the pinnacle of impossible. Along this hierarchy of potentiality, there are consistent, observable patterns. Again, I think imagining these patterns like music is apt. You cannot see notes, though you can see the piano key that manifests them. There is a somewhat ethereal realm of air that moves in geometric patterns to our ear. This medium has patterns that hierarchically arrange, like notes, octaves of notes that resonate in mathematical ratios, chords that are comprised of separate notes that work mathematically in harmony with one another, and then progressions of chords that work over time to produce harmonic compatibility within the context of a song. These patterns only exist when they do, but the laws that govern them, however, exist prior to their manifestation. These patterns are shapes in the realm of potentiality, and these shapes are hierarchically arranged. The note is seen as harmonious within the context of a key, and then a chord. The chord is seen as harmonious within the context of its progression, and the progression is seen as harmonious within the movements of a song. All components of the song are understood teleologically and gain their individual value by how well they manifest the melodic ideal of the song. But further, apart from only the physicality of the music, we also seem to think that some topics or themes are expressed better or worse by some songs, i.e. best love songs, best heartbreak ballads, cathartic angry songs, etc., or a song whose lyrics clash with the feelings of the melody. The songs are judged on how well its constituent parts imaged the central theme of the song. Another way to conceptualize this hierarchy of teleological categories could be the way we rank order the natural world around us. I'll focus on the animal kingdom, for example. Your dog or your cat is an individual that derives its existence from a chain of being. It goes without saying that we start with isness, or what Heidegger dubbed Dasein, under which we then delineate living things, or what is organic, from that which is not, which in biology is simply called life. Then there is the rank of quote-unquote domain below life, which branches into 2 to 3 categories of kingdom, archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. The domain split into 6 kingdoms, of which Animalia, your dog or cat, belong to. We then descend into ever more refined qualities through phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, until within the species category, you descend into the idiosyncratic body of your dog or cat. These bodies are idiosyncratic, but they causally result from ever-increasing levels of homogeneity. While the body of your cat or dog is singular, its form derives from causality. Dogs have dog-like qualities. Your dog does not have wings, and it is precisely because of the collapsed potential of not having wings, among other qualities of collapsed potential, that you notice your dog as a dog. What potentials an idiosyncratic thing shares with other things is what condenses into an archetype. There is what we could call a dogness that all dogs share, though expressed in particular ways with each individual dog. Then there is a mammalness that all dogs, cats, humans, etc. share with one another that reveals another node on the hierarchy of potentiality. Every new level of categorization could be conceptualized like the ranks in a business. Each subsequent level below CEO or president is organized by a single individual or cabinet of individuals at rank above their department. This ranking of organization names each rank accordingly, with every subsequent rank of delegation utilizing a different term of nomenclature. Put practically, and in the example of a chain restaurant, the owner hires a general manager to oversee the operation of a specific store. The specific restaurant is like a node, or a note within the teleological hierarchy, in which potentiality collapses at a specific resonant frequency. The potential for the entire brand collapses in its specific incarnation of a single store in a single location that is governed by an entity lower on the ladder of potentiality to that of the owner or CEO. While the potential for the entire business as a whole is governable at the level of CEO, this potential collapses at a specific node in the form of a restaurant, which is governed by an entity lower on the hierarchy, the general manager. The potential within this restaurant, however, then collapses at several lower levels as well, within the ranks of shift supervisors, which then collapse potential into even smaller resonant frequencies to that of employees. An employee's agency within the potentiality hierarchy is limited to their specific job, and the success or failure of this job is inextricably linked to the business as a whole. The business only ideally manifests if on every layer of jurisdiction, the entities enmeshed fulfill their functions, and yet an employee may quit with little consequence to the whole, while the CEO can shape the destiny of the business. One would rightly make a corollary to this example with essentially all human hierarchies, and one that specifically comes to mind is the feudal structure many human governances adopted throughout our history. Now, I'm not advocating for the feudal system, simply using it as an example for an emergent phenomena that seems to mirror, though poorly at times, a transcendent structure. Saying that hierarchy is built into the cosmos is not the advocation for a specific incarnation of a hierarchy. That disclaimer aside, I think it is no coincidence that the mythologies of old contain hierarchies of jurisdiction in their pantheons that mirrored their systems of government. For man is not some alien foisted upon the natural world, but is a being of nature, and thus the patterns of nature would play out in the complex organizations of mankind. I believe this is why it is easy and probably right for the pre-modern mind to imagine the world of potentiality, or what they would call the realm of God or gods, is organized in a similar fashion, with areas of jurisdiction that correspond to the physical laws they observed. This is what I attempted to outline in the preface, using Poseidon as the god of water in general, with lesser gods beneath him, specific bodies of water, who were themselves in charge of the nymphs of rivers, tributaries, etc. The point here is that physical objects and systems seem to be mirroring transcendental ones, as made evident by even our own materialist paradigm's law of physics. This is also mirrored within the immaterial notion of logic itself, for nothing in nature grows or acts illogically. Thus, the rules of logic must be on a plane of reality above the idiosyncratic objects that act according to its tenets. Because, like I said, the hierarchy of potentiality bears at its top the impossible, with a cascade beneath it of increasingly collapsed potentials, until we arrive at the ones that have literal manifestation at the base, or what we call the physical world. The triangle you've drawn derives its existence from the collapsing potentials of this hierarchy. It must first have been possible, and then it passes through the layer in which all possibilities exist to the layer of shape. Then it collapses all potential shapes into triangularity. Then all potential triangles are collapsed into a specific orientation of angles that exist in potentially any size, color, etc., until after all of this, all potentials are collapsed into the specific triangle you have drawn. The main point I'm trying to touch on here is that every idiosyncratic thing descends from a cascade of potentials that collapse into the object, and that every level of categorization on this hierarchy exhibits networking patterns that express an underlying logic or shape to the cosmos. While the order of operations or delegation on the hierarchy of potential for the triangle is somewhat arbitrary, the potential color layer, for example, could come before or after the size layer. All refining layers for a triangle, like size, color, etc., must necessarily come after or subordinate to the higher abstract layers, like being a triangle versus being a square. This implies that there is a particular order of operations for condensing potential shapes into manifested idiosyncratic shapes. I want to argue that these layers of collapsed potentiality exhibit a law of physics that's transcendental to, or at least on par with, our own literal laws of physics. I also want to posit that the nodes of potentiality on this hierarchy interestingly maps onto many ancient pantheons or cosmologies. If all dogs possess some dogness, from what Platonic-like ideal dog do we use as a metric? Why do we categorize dogness as distinct from catness or humanness? And are these archetypal forms created when a category is drawn, or are the categories revealing some structure behind reality? I'm arguing that this hierarchy could be understood as increasing levels of abstraction, with every rung on the ladder representing an octave of collapsed abstraction descending down into the idiosyncratic or physical world. To ancient man, the ascent into further levels of abstraction was symbolically understood as climbing the mountain of God or gods, with every step going up representing another layer of jurisdiction by a faction of gods or angels greater than the step below, with the utterly ineffable or impossible at the top. This ocean of abstraction is aptly understood with the symbol of our physical oceans. There's the concept of water as a sheer abstraction bearing specific qualities that delineate it as water versus any other substance. Then there are specific bodies of water, etc., all the way down to a single drop. The larger the quantity of water, the more it symbolically conveys the abstract, and thus we see its symbolic value in many mythologies as the ocean of chaos before creation. This hierarchy of potentiality is also observable in our stories and the characters that inhabit them. These organizations of potential, or archetypes, don't exist in space and time. They manifest in space and time. They only exist as shapes of potential. For example, the hero, the lovable scoundrel, the villain, etc., are patterns that, similar to the video game example, will act in specific ways in a given circumstance. If the circumstance does not exist, then the characters do not manifest. These characters are teleological objects that do not exist until they do. But if we can notice consistent through lines across their many manifestations, then in some sense, these objects exist transcendentally. If the lovable scoundrel can be in both Star Wars as Han Solo and Aladdin in his movie, then this archetype exists independently from either of them. Think of the characters in a story like musical notes. These characters can work with the other characters harmoniously in a team like a chord, and these chords move through the story to produce its conclusion like a song. In fact, we seem to think good characters are those that particularly manifest the theme of a story well. The theme of a story is like the theme of a song, and the characters are like the notes and chords that can either work harmoniously or dissonantly with that theme. The characters are also ranked as necessary or superfluous by their accomplishment of a story's plot. We have found that there are consistent story beats, character archetypes, and plots that seem to work well, similarly to chords and chord progressions, song structures, etc. In the case of story, these geometric shapes of potentiality are reflections of human psychology, meaning they represent what could be called geometric shapes of potentiality in the human mind. Yet, again, these shapes are not found solely within a single human mind, but across all human minds, and across all human minds throughout time. This means that while the manifestations of psychological archetypes manifest within humans, these archetypes, like shapes and notes, etc., exist transcendentally as a complex hierarchy of shapes in the realm of potentiality. You can be a healthy person or a narcissistic person, but you cannot not be a person. The potential shapes you can organize psychologically within are limited in similar fashion to that of our triangle example. A triangle can be any color and any size and bear multiple organizations of angles, but a triangle can never have 4 sides. This limitation is an evidence that the shape exists transcendentally from the idiosyncratic shape bearing its likeness. For it is right to say that a given triangle possesses the trait of being triangle-like. Meaning, like Plato believed, there is a transcendental archetype, as is the case with pi, phi, etc., that all instantiations bear likeness to, and by which we both notice triangularity, and by which triangularity is revealed. So then what transcendental image does human story, myth, psychology, etc. reveal? What standard do we use to gauge humanness? What face are we using to sketch the image of human, and use as a stencil for our pens to trace, and our erasers to adjust? It is my argument that it is the transcendental deep that humanity has been dangerously plunging into with hopes to answer this question. This is an ocean, though its waves are not made of water, but of time. The ebb and flow of its currents branch out like the fractaling branches of a tree, with our consciousness acting as an undulating snake climbing the branches that condense, while the others are pruned, cascading away as potentials collapse. We only see the branch we're on, but the ocean of branches rooted in an endless sea is still very much there. Though invisible, we feel the ebb and flow of its currents as the blind fingers of our generations search its depths for some insight, for some sight beyond sight, to help orient our existence as temporal beings. We're beings that both exist simply as a present state, but also stretched out across time, across all causes that led up to our present, and all effects we will leave after our present is gone. It's as if we're steering some massive snake whose body upon which we ride has become so large we can no longer see the tail, let alone keep track of where it is, or know where we've come from. And the head is so far beyond our sight, we have no idea where our steering is ultimately leading us to, as we all the while make adjustments based solely on what we can immediately see. This realm works and acts according to some organizing principle itself. Otherwise, the various manifestations of its hierarchy I've listed, like music, governance, business, shapes, mathematical constants, physical laws, etc., would each bear their own idiosyncratic flow of logic, meaning each of these manifested hierarchies are arranged according to some law or logic that expresses itself across each of them. It's like a world or realm that bears its own physics or laws. It is a space, though it is outside of space, and it has patterns and processes, though it is out of time. The only place it exists is within space and time, and yet it exists completely and transcendentally independent from the vessels that give it form. As I said in the preface, our world, ourselves, and everything that exists is like the sand on a beach that forms around some impossible thing to produce the footprint we call reality. Though we cannot directly see the foot, by studying the footprint, we get glimpses of what it looks like. The land of the gods, the cosmic ocean, or the realm of potentiality. These might well name the deep this series of videos will attempt to map. In part 2 of this chapter, we will dive into this deep and search for the monsters that dwell therein.